Streaming from Abbey Cat Recording Studio in Chicago.
You are listening to Influenced, a podcast where we explore what makes great music influential.
Now you only get it in your night dress. Discarded all the naughty nights for niceness. Landed in a very common crisis. Everything's in order in a black hole. Nothing seems to pity is the past though. A Bloody Mary's like an El Tabasco. Remember when you used to be a rascal.
All right, this is Influenced. I believe this is the 6th episode.
Yeah, I think it's number 6.
And this week we're doing the British band Arctic Monkeys. They catapulted to success in the mid-2000s, like 2005, 2006, with their first singles off their debut album. And they really just took the European music scene by storm and quickly became one of the biggest bands in the indie canon.
It happened quickly on the scene, right? Right out of the gate.
Yeah, they definitely came out kicking, and they formed as kind of a high school band in the early 2000s, like I think 2002, 2003, like the early members, Alex Turner, Jamie Cook, Andy Nicholson, and Matt Helders. They kind of all grown up together, just like went to school together. Matt Helders and Alex Turner have known each other since they were like babies. Like I think you can find like pictures of them hanging out when they're like 7 or 8, like online.
And they just kind of, hey, let's become a rock band.
Yeah, they just kind of wanted to do it one day, and then
I think there were like some guitars under a Christmas tree or something like that.
Well, they basically all just like decided, like when it was like 2002 or 2003, the Britpop scene was kind of at its peak with Oasis like dominating stadiums and the charts. And a lot of indie rock bands were starting to kind of creep up in the early 2000s, like the Strokes, the Hives especially one of the early big influences on the Arctic Monkeys, and also like a lot of early Jack White projects like the White Stripes and the Rock on Tours were definitely kind of cropping up and getting really, really big and massive. And there were also kind of an influx of British bands like the Libertines, Franz Ferdinand, even some smaller, more niche UK acts like the Zootons and the Pigeon Detectives that started kind of getting big around this time, that like really kind of started to put like a bit of a pinpoint on the UK as one of the forefronts of this kind of new indie scene, a lot like New York. With the Strokes and Interpol and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs kind of all coming out around the same time. So a lot of people were kind of looking at the UK being like, okay, well, maybe there's another kind of indie band on the horizon, or where they were just kind of, and just keeping an eye on the scene in Europe as a whole, but kind of specifically the UK. And while they're not like a UK band specifically, I know I mentioned the Hives for a second earlier. They were one of the bigger influences on early Arctic Monkeys output, like the really punky attitude and snarling, heavy power chord guitars. So here's Hate to Say I Told You So by the Hives. So you can really hear the like punk attitude, and I mean that song sounds like it could almost be like a punk track from one of the 70s or 80s like bands in the prime of the kind of punk genre. But that kind of really full throttle sound, and like the vocals that aren't even really sung, they're more kind of shouted or just put in your face, with kind of combined with the like propelling, just rhythm section and the like massively distorted and like blown out guitar sounds, like that was a major influence on the early Arctic Monkeys. Really kind of like it's almost the blueprint for what they kind of did with their first album and their first few releases, including their first album, Whatever People Say I Am, That's What I'm Not. But they really, like, their first few releases, like their first album and first few EPs really stressed like this sound that was defined by these razor sharp distorted guitar chords, propulsive like rhythm section and drums, and like Alex Turner's like very witty in your face vocals that weren't always sung. They were sometimes shouted and sometimes almost like talked at you. It was a very interesting, almost like kind of rap influenced approach that Arctic Monkeys took to their first few songs that got them notoriety. So here's their first big single. It became so big. It was a #1 hit in the UK charts. I Bet You Look Good on the Dance Floor, from their first album, Whatever People Say I Am, That's What I'm Not.
Stop making the eyes at me, I'll stop making the eyes at you. What it is that surprises me is that I don't really want you to. When your shoulders are frozen, over you're an explosion. Your name isn't real, but I don't care for sand and lights in a fuse. My results in a bang, but my pango. I bet that you look good on the...
That's, kind of obviously, I'll state the obvious. Every band's dream to come out with a #1 right out of the gate.
Oh, most definitely. I mean, like, that's kind of almost like biopic perfect moment for the Arctic Monkeys.
But they kept it going.
Yeah, they definitely kept it going. Like even the next single they released, When the Sun Goes Down, also went straight to #1, and that's not even like a major single track. Like, it's a fairly down-tempo song for early Arctic Monkeys. And so they were kind of firing on all cylinders at all times in the early portions of their career. And their first album also straight to #1 in the UK charts. So they were really like immediately kind of one of the biggest bands to watch in the mid-2000s. Like, they were playing and even headlining massive festivals, like not even 3 years into their professional careers. Like, they headlined Glastonbury in 2007, having just released their second album. So not even barely 2 albums into it, and they're already headlining what's generally considered the biggest music festival in European music for sure. So they were kind of immediately like thrust into the big game, like no gradual rise to stardom like a lot of bands can kind of afford. It was kind of immediately like, you're into the big leagues now, you're playing, you got to write hits. So they kind of immediately got back in the studio after their first few big tours and were like working really hard on their follow-up LP. And during that time, they actually swapped out the original bassist, Andy Nicholson, for the member who still plays bass with them today, Nick O'Malley. I guess Andy Nicholson kind of had some mental issues that got in the way of really capitalizing on the band's success, and he wasn't able to tour America for their first American tour, so they drafted in Nick O'Malley as a replacement. Originally sort of temporary, but it kind of just stuck. So here's one of the tracks off their second LP, Favorite Worst Nightmare, called 505. That's actually a collaboration with another English musician, kind of up-and-coming English musician at the time, Miles Kane. So here's 505 off of Favorite Worst Nightmare.
Stop and wait a sec. When you look at me like that, my darling, what did you expect? I'd probably still adore you with your hands around my neck, or I did last time I checked.
So while Favorite Worst Nightmare still has a lot of that very heavy indie influence, that very heavy early 2000s indie influence to it, the album is definitely not as unrefined. It's not really a punk rock record anymore. They're making more refined rock music. They're definitely taking more time in the studio actually writing songs and getting the songs to sound exactly how they want them to. Like, they're definitely beginning to experiment with a lot more with just textures in the studio, like adding some keyboards on songs. Like that song 505 relies really heavily on this like repeating kind of organ chord progression played by Alex Turner that kind of repeats through the whole song. So they were definitely looking for ways to kind of expand their sound while still retaining a lot of that early strokesy indie influence. But as they kind of got older and older, like they're still very young. They're still like barely out of their teens at this point in the mid to late 2000s, like at this point, like 2008, 2009. But they're starting to kind of come into themselves a little bit more. Like they're all in their 20s by this point. A lot of them have started to like kind of enjoy their lifestyle a little bit more. Like they're hanging out with other musicians. A lot of like Alex Turner took a few month break from the Arctic Monkeys in between their second and third albums, actually, to join Miles Kane, the musician who guested with them on 505, in a side project called The Last Shadow Puppets that saw him kind of playing like very, very old-fashioned, like very 60s and 50s influenced kind of Baroque pop, with a lot of strings and a lot more keyboards and things like that. So they were definitely starting to weigh their horizons a little bit and just kind of want to expand a little bit more, just kind of out of that indie sphere and not kind of get boxed in as another indie band, because in the late 2000s the music industry was kind of a little saturated with just like the indie band of the week. So they wanted to kind of break away from that, and they started getting influenced by a lot of more vintage music, like a lot of 70s and 60s rock, like the 13th Floor Elevators and Cream and Jimi Hendrix, and a lot more of the kind of more experimental side of 60s rock and roll. And that's also when they started, like I said, I mentioned earlier, they were hanging out with a lot more other musicians and starting to let like outside influence kind of creep into their band sphere. And one of the biggest outside influences in Arctic Monkeys in the early kind of 2000s, or early 2010s, I should say at this point, was Josh Homme and Queens of the Stone Age as a whole. Josh Homme, if you don't know, is the frontman of Queens of the Stone Age. And in the late 2000s and early 2010s, Arctic Monkeys and Queens of the Stone Age started playing some shows together at like festivals, and then I think Arctic Monkeys did a few shows as kind of a support act for Queens of the Stone Age. So they started to kind of developing this camaraderie, which culminated in Josh Homme producing a majority of Arctic Monkeys' third album, Humbug, which to that point had been their biggest sonic departure from their kind of established indie sound. And they were taking a lot of influence from like kind of heavier, more experimental 70s rock like Cream and the 13th Floor Elevators, while also taking influence from a lot of the stoner rock like Queens of the Stone Age at the time. So here's Queens of the Stone Age, Go With the Flow, off their iconic album, Songs for the Deaf. So when Josh started really working with the Arctic Monkeys, he wanted to kind of change up their way of creation a little bit, and he wanted them to really delve into what the studio could be as an instrument. So he had them build all their songs for their album Humbug from the ground up, where they usually kind of built them piece by piece, like recording some of the parts together and then adding some parts on top. He had them record everything from the ground up. So starting with the drums, getting the drums sounding exactly how they wanted, and then putting some bass and guitars on top of that, and then the vocals, and then whatever else they could think of. So they really started layering their sound and like getting into how exactly they could make a song kind of move in and of it in itself, with just like changing textures and like increased proficiency in just like how they want things to sound and where they want to put things in their songs. So here's Crying Lightning off their Josh Homme produced album Humbug.
Outside the cafe by the cracker factory, you were practicing a magic trick, and my thoughts got rude as you talked and chewed on the last.
Yeah, it's a great song, and you can really hear that influence, like you pointed out, Blake, with Queens of the Stone Age, that layering, and the big drums, big bass. Yeah, big new sound for them.
Yeah, so they were really getting into that like stoner rock and very psychedelic sound, and kind of after Humbug, and just like really, I mean, and Humbug was really kind of the biggest shift in sound that they had made as a band since they really started. Like Alex Turner as a vocalist really came into his own, and like he sounds like almost a completely different frontman off Humbug, and from Humbug really to their career now than he did when he was a kid just screaming like a punk. But so so Humbug is really the biggest, like I would say, transitional record in the Arctic Monkeys kind of catalog and their discography so far, and that it was kind of where they went from being just an indie band to being a band that can kind of encompass influence from a lot of different musical genres, and just like any era of rock and roll that they feel suited to, they can kind of make their own and do what they want with. And that is definitely something that kind of played into their next sort of era as a band after Humbug, which is when they went into write and record their album, that their fourth album as a band, the aptly titled "Suck It and See," their fourth album as a full band. Alex Turner's like sixth album that he's made up into this point in his career, with his side project with the Last Shadow Puppets, and he also did a bit of a side step into the soundtrack world in 2010 when he soundtracked the kind of indie film Submarine. So Alex is definitely at this point in their career kind of worked his songwriter magic in a lot of different areas. And they kind of after Humbug, after all the layering and all the very intricate recording of Humbug, kind of wanted to take it back, something a little bit simpler in terms of just like making the record. So when they went to record the songs that Alex had written for Suck It and See, they decided to record a lot of them live in the studio as just like a four-piece band, or maybe with one other musician playing some keyboards or percussion. So much of Suck It and See was recorded and written and recorded by the Arctic Monkeys playing live as a 4 or 5-piece band in the studio. And so here's the title track off that album, Suck It and See, from their 2012 record, Suck It and See.
Sitting
After you talked about them recording that more or less live in the studio, and then you hear the song right after you talked about that, I'm picturing in my head, these guys in the studio ready to go, the producers in the control room, gives them the hand signal, and off they go. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, so they definitely, I mean, Suck It and See was recorded entirely live with like maybe 1 to 2 or 3 overdubs for each song, like just a guitar solo or some backing vocals and things like that. So they really leaned into the vintage live feel for that album, and it really comes across in the very 50s and 60s influenced rhythm sections. Like you can almost hear like a Roy Orbison or even like a Elvis track in the drums on a lot of those songs, and like it's got a very, very, very California kind of vibe, and just even the way it's like recorded and mixed, it sounds like one of those mid 70s, mid 80s California kind of major rock records. And it's kind of one of the only records that's kind of come out in the last decade or so that's really adequately sounded like an album from the 60s or 70s. And that even that's definitely something they've even carried forward into their newest album, Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, is definitely an even heavier exercise in the creation of a kind of almost a new vintage album. But after Suck It and See, they kind of did another almost studio 180 in that, like, they wanted to kind of make their almost most produced record yet with their next album, which ended up becoming kind of their biggest hit, 2013's AM. And that album really started out because they really wanted to finally crack America the way they had cracked a lot of the rest of the world. And a lot of that kind of desire stemmed from a 2012 tour that they did with the Black Keys as an opening act across America. And Alex Turner talked about being an opening act again was a little bit of a weird experience for him, because he was playing these arenas across the US, and he'd be looking up during a song and he'd see a guy in the like 10th row just looking at his phone because he was just waiting for the Black Keys to come on. So that really kind of propelled them to want to like show up the kind of audience that they felt like maybe had been ignoring them on a mass scale kind of for the majority of their career. So they really looked to like a lot of American hip hop and other just like modern American influence when they were making AM. And Alex Turner kind of once described AM as like an album where they took these desert rock kind of Queens of the Stone Age riffs and put a Dr. Dre beat behind them. So he was definitely really thinking from a hip hop kind of head's writing space during that time. And he was definitely really, really influenced by a lot of that 90s kind of California hip hop, like Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and NWA. So here's Still DRE off of Dr. Dre's 2001 album, The Chronic.
Yeah, nigga, I'm still fucking with you. Still waters run deep. Still Snoop Dogg and DRE. Nah, nigga. Guess who's back? Still doing that shit, Andre? Oh, for sure. Yeah. Check me out. It's still Dre Day, nigga. AK, nigga. Though I've grown a lot, can't keep it home a lot. Cause when I frequent the spots that I'm known to rock, you hear the bass from the truck when I'm on the block. Ladies, they pay homage, but haters say Dre fell off. How, nigga, my last album was The Chronic. They wanna know if he still got it. They say raps change. They wanna know how I feel about it.
I can hear that big sound from AM.
Yeah, those massive drums and just like that hip hop kind of bass line and groove really is something that kind of carried across pretty much every song on the AM record. So just to give you a quick taste, here's Why Do You Only Call Me When You're High off of the 2013 album AM.
It tells me it's home time, but I'm not finished, 'cause you're not by my side. And as I arrived, I thought I saw you leaving, carrying your shoes. Decided that once again I was just dreaming of bumping into you. Now it's 3 in the morning, and I'm trying to change your mind. Left you multiple missed calls, and to my message you replied. Why'd you only call me when you're high?
So you can really hear how just important groove and like the beat were to those songs and on the AM kind of era Arctic Monkeys, and you can really like kind of headbang along to pretty much every single track on that album, which is not something you can say for most indie bands for sure, without being like cheesy or like feel like you don't know what you're doing. Like one of the only rock bands to accurately like craft a really, really deep hip hop influence without it turning into like rap rock or something like that. Something kind of just like totally degenerative from all the genres itself. It's very much like they created a very, very unique record with AM that just like ties in just like pop music and like a lot of alternative influence, and like they reworked a song or actually more of a poem from an old like post-punk poet, John Cooper Clarke, who was like mostly famous for like playing shows with Joy Division and playing shows with like Iggy Pop. But they reworked one of his songs at the end of AM as kind of a like almost a hip hop version of the song "I Want to Be Yours." But I'll play a snippet of that real quick. But it's a very, very cool, like Alex Turner took the original lyrics of that John Cooper Clarke poem and kind of put them to this very unique backdrop of a beat that like sounds like it's dripping from a cave, but it's just like a very, very unique rock record for the decade of the 2010s, and it was definitely one of the biggest rock records that happened this decade, and like is definitely also one of the reasons it's one of the best-selling vinyl records of the like last decade, and is definitely big reason for the just like vinyl comeback with like teenagers and kids and stuff like that. Like this is definitely one of those records that's in every Urban Outfitters, and you probably even find it in the like little tiny vinyl section at like Walmart or Target. Like this is definitely one of those like iconic records, along with like Tame Impala's Currents and like a lot of like Jack White's releases in the last few years that have been just like really important and like keeping the vinyl resurgence alive. But this is "I Want to Be Yours," the closing track off of AM, which was definitely the most successful Arctic Monkeys album, but in the US and honestly abroad. Like Do I Want to Know, probably their biggest hit now, has like almost, it's like 100,000 listens, 100 million listens away from having 1 billion streams on Spotify, which is something that I think only like 50 or 60 songs ever have reached. So it definitely shows you how big this album was for the band, and definitely continued to like skyrocket them kind of about as high as you can, to the highest echelon of like really any rock band. Like they're definitely up there with like they could probably play, like they were opening up for the Black Keys in 2012 now, but I feel like Arctic Monkeys could probably play any venue the Black Keys could, and probably some that the Black Keys couldn't. But here's "I Want to Be Yours."
Vacuum cleaner, breathing in your dust. I wanna be a Ford Cortina, I will never rust. If you like your coffee,
Well, you and I both saw them on that tour, Blake, and
Yeah,
they
that was a
definitely
great-
won over. It was at
great
Madison
tour.
Square Garden. I don't think
Yeah,
anybody sat
definitely.
down the entire time. It was amazing.
No, definitely not. Yeah, that was definitely, and I think that show was their first official headline show in an arena in the United States. So that AM tour was definitely just like an amazingly successful tour for them as a band, and definitely like kind of set the tone for them where they were going for the next like couple years. Like they toured. AM came out in mid 2013, I believe, and they toured that album until the first few months of 2015. So they toured that album for like almost 2 years.
Amazing.
So they definitely all, by the end of that tour, definitely all kind of needed a bit of a break from the band, and like a number of them have had kids. I think Alex Turner, the frontman, is actually the only one now that doesn't have kids. But I know like their bassist and their lead guitarist Jamie Cook have both like settled down and both have like families. Well, I know Matt Helders and Alex Turner have like kind of settled down in the past, but I think both of them are still just kind of out and about, just like floating around. But this cover at the end of AM with covering this John Cooper Clarke song definitely kind of set the stage for where Arctic Monkeys were going to go, like in the future. Like they took a five or so year break from about, or I guess 4 year break from 2015 to about 2018. But I guess kind of in that time, like Alex Turner kind of fell out of love with writing songs on like the guitar and was just like feeling like it was almost too predictable. Like if he picked up a guitar, he just knew what was going to happen. Like he knew what kind of song he would write if he picked up the guitar and stuff like that. So I think they had a couple kind of writing jam sessions that didn't really go as well as they wanted, and like so they were kind of for a while they weren't quite sure what was going to happen. Like they weren't thinking of breaking up or anything, obviously, but like Alex Turner went on another tour and did another album with the Last Shadow Puppets, and Matt Helders got involved with like producing a couple artists, and he also, like Matt Helders, played drums on an Iggy Pop record that he did with a couple of the guys from Queens of the Stone Age. So a lot of the members stayed pretty busy in their kind of break. But in the last, like, I think kind of starting in like 2016, Alex Turner got like he got like a really nice upright piano as a gift from their manager, I think.
Yeah.
Kind of as just like I think it was his 30th birthday present, because Alex Turner recently, kind of the past few years, turned 30.
Okay.
Because they're still, just because when they like started out, even though they started out like over 10 years ago, they were like 17, 18 when they started out. So they're still not that old. Like I think Alex Turner might be 31, 32. Like they're still all in their early 30s. So they still definitely have like a decent, like at least another decade of like probably a lot of Arctic Monkeys material kind of to get out. But after that record, when they were kind of just like relaxing and just like kind of figuring out where to go creatively, Alex started writing a lot on that piano that he got as a gift. He was also just like really affected by just like a lot of things that were happening in like the world. Like David Bowie passing away was something that had probably a pretty profound effect on him. Just like David Bowie's music in general was always like probably a decent influence, but it was definitely like an influence that he started realizing a lot more, just like with the last Shadow Puppets album, and then also just like in some of the more recent Arctic Monkeys work, like AM and Suck It and See was definitely like a lot of that 70s rock influence. And so like there were a lot of other artists, and Leonard Cohen as well, who passed away, was another big influence on Alex Turner, just like as like a lyricist and just like a songwriter. But Alex Turner talks a lot about just like getting really into the just like the Spiders from Mars era, Ziggy Stardust and stuff like that. So I wanted to play the track Moon Age Daydream off of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, because it kind of sets the stage for where Arctic Monkeys were sort of going with their most recent release, which is called Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino. But this is Moon Age Daydream off of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars.
I'm an alligator. I'm a mama, papa coming for you. I'm the space invader. I'll be a rock and rollin' bitch for you. Keep your mouth shut. Just walking like a big monkey bird. And I'm busting up a brains for the world.
So he was definitely, just the whole band was definitely like very inspired by the glam rock period and just like that whole period of like rock in the 70s and 80s. But like when they started getting back together with these songs that Alex had started writing on the piano, like they kind of noticed that like the songs were a lot different because like they had never heard Alex like play piano before. Like Jamie Cook like talks about like how he was one of the first to kind of hear a lot of these songs because Alex just invited him down before the rest of the band, kind of just to like work out some parts for the songs and stuff. But he talked about like listening to the songs at first and being like, wow, I've never really, this is definitely not what I would have expected. And they all came to really, really enjoy the songs, but it was definitely like a bit of a surprise for even the band themselves. But Alex kind of got very into, like, he was very aware of just like everything that was happening politically around the United States at the time, just like with Trump getting elected and just like a lot of just like politics and just like the politics in Britain with Brexit and everything like that. So he was just very, like, he's never really written political music before, but Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino is definitely like Alex Turner's kind of, I guess just like the best way to describe it is his just like kind of looking out on a current society kind of from this like gauge of almost like a 2001 Space Odyssey kind of sci-fi concept album. Like the whole concept of the Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino is that it's a hotel on the moon that like was built after there was some kind of catastrophe on Earth that caused a lot of people to move to these like the moon resort or whatever. So it's a loose concept album. It's not like entirely about that, but a lot of the songs kind of touch on just like current societal problems and like the current leader of the free world and just like Donald Trump and stuff like that. But it looks at like society and just technology and our reliance on things like that from this like air of like a glam rock I guess concept album from space almost. But like I'm gonna play the title track just called Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, and it kind of lays out that specific song kind of lays out the character that Alex Turner is playing kind of across the album, where he's like an observer, or maybe he's a worker at the hotel, but he observes a lot of just like the aristocratic people who he sees, and just like the way the world kind of works and revolves around from his eyes on the, I guess, from up on the moon. But it's a fantastic record that's really, really creative, and they really went for it with just like a record that like there's guitars all over every song on the record, but it doesn't feel like a guitar record. It feels like it feels almost like Arctic Monkeys making their own version of like a Pet Sounds or a Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It's definitely like a take on that kind of almost pop art version of like what a rock band could be, especially like it takes a lot of influence from the glam rock and the Pet Sounds of the world. But here's Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino.
Good afternoon.
fancy base, hotel and casino. Mark speaking. Please tell me, how may I direct your call? This magical thinking feels as if it really might catch on.
So the record obviously has a very old school feel, but like that the bass and the drums are still very like locked in, similar to that the way they were on AM. It's just they have a very like old school, very Pet Sounds, very like glam rock aesthetic to the whole sound of the record. And Alex Turner actually recorded a lot of this record himself at his home studio, kind of in his house. So it does have a little bit of that like kind of lower-fi home recorded quality, which I think is a very cool thing for a band as big as Arctic Monkeys to kind of explore this far into their career. And they're talking a lot about like Alex Turner, as good of a songwriter as he is, until this record had kind of always written about just like relationships and women and just his lifestyle around kind of just the way it formed around those things and stuff like that. But like Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino is a very, very much a like just a look into how he views society, and he's singing about just like protest songs and a lot of just like religious idealizations and things like that. It's very, very interesting, and very cool to see a rock band of that caliber kind of explore. But I mean, they've had a very, very long career, like over a decade now, and they've definitely influenced they've been influenced by countless of bands, and they've influenced countless bands. Like Alex Turner and Matt Helders have produced artists of their own, like Alexandra Savior, and a fantastic like indie artist in her own right, had her first record, like she co-wrote and produced a lot of it with Alex Turner. And it's got like a little bit of his kind of staple on it, but it's very much her own kind of project, and it's very much her own sound. But it's just like that's just one of the many ways you can kind of see their influence on just like indie music and as a whole, and like countless indie artists like Tame Impala and Haim all count Arctic Monkeys as just an influence on their career in one way or another.
In my mind I've acquired a tangle I can't undo. I've been thinking about nothing else lately. Does it feel as if somebody's keeping an eye on you? Peripheral visions playing tricks.
And yeah, Arctic Monkeys are definitely one of the most like successful indie bands, probably of the last like decade or so. Honestly, like they've been kicking since like 2006, and they've been basically have had endless success since then. Like everything they've done has essentially become very successful, and that includes stuff like Alexandra Savior's music that Alex has produced. So they've definitely become like one of the biggest successes in the modern music industry.
Yeah, I mean, given how much they've experimented and evolved, it really makes you wonder what's next.
Definitely. I mean, you could really, I have no idea, and they're one of my favorite bands. Like, it's cool to say you have no idea where your favorite band is going to go next, and it's very true, because I do have no idea where they're going to go next. So the next Arctic Monkeys album could sound like Depeche Mode for all I know. So
right,
like, I mean, I think they could pull off pretty much anything, just based on how much they've covered already and how much they continue to just like want to push forward, it seems like. But they're a fantastic band. And I'll leave kind of everyone else with one more track off their most recent record, Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino. It's kind of the biggest single, I guess. It's called 4 out of 5. It's definitely the biggest like festival track off this record. I saw them at Lollapalooza off the tour of this record, and this was definitely a big sing along. I think they opened with it, but it was a great show, and they're a fantastic live band, so they definitely are one of the like indie bands I feel like they'll still definitely be kicking in another 10 years time, and that can't be said for a lot of bands that are out and about right now, even the very, very successful ones. But here's 4 out of 5, the lead single off of Tranquility Base, Hotel and Casino, the newest record from Arctic Monkeys. Thank you guys so much. This has been the 6th episode of Influenced. Thanks so much again for tuning in.
Advertising imaginative ways. Start your free trial today. Come on in the water's lovely look. You could meet someone you like. You're in the meat of your strike. It is that easy. Lunar surface on a Saturday night. Dressed up in silver and white with colored old gray whistle test lights.